Hi, good evening. I'm so happy to be here with you, and I feel a little naked because I've been on a 60-city book tour with a 1-year-old, and this trip was the one trip I decided to leave my baby behind. And the room is full of babies, so it's my kind of room, and I really appreciate being here. And I also felt very touched. Thank you so much, Heather and everybody, for putting the stories of our members on your tables. Those are stories from the book of our very real members, some of whom were in the video. And isn't that video amazing? So that video was created by a restaurant worker, leader of the Restaurant Opportunity Center, who is a restaurant worker and also obviously has a career in videography. And all of the people in the video are members of ROC. And the video was filmed at Colors, our worker-owned cooperative restaurant in New York City. And it got, we put it up to kind of build a buzz around the book, and to date it's gotten 235,000 views on YouTube. It's really made the rounds, and it's really changed for us the dialogue about what's happening in this industry. But I have to say, 12 years ago, me, myself, I've now kind of dedicated my life to this industry, but 12 years ago, me, myself, I knew nothing about what was in that video or what's in this book. I lived in New York City. I had just graduated from law school. I was working as an organizer out in Long Island, New York, and I was organizing factory workers and custodial workers and restaurant workers, and every evening I would come back into the city. I lived in Brooklyn, so I'd come back into Manhattan or Brooklyn and eat out, because I was young, and that's what you do when you're in New York. You eat out sometimes 3 times a day, and I did. I ate out a lot. I ate out, at the fanciest restaurants, and at the hole-in-the-wall restaurants, and at the vegetarian restaurants, and at the great Asian fusion restaurants. And I have to admit, even though I was, working with low-wage workers all day, and sometimes restaurant workers, every evening I would eat, and I would hardly, if ever, think about the people who are touching my food, who are preparing it, who are serving it, who are bringing it to my table. And in the book I argue that we as Americans, we actually eat out more frequently than anybody else on earth, more frequently and frankly with more gusto, with more, we tend to spend the most amazing, special, intimate, wonderful moments of our lives in restaurants. We get married in restaurants. I got proposed to in a restaurant. Many of us can remember birthdays or anniversaries or very, very special life moments. But if you think for a moment about those special life moments that maybe you had in a restaurant, it's very hard for most of us to remember anybody that touched our food in those special life moments, anybody at all. They're invisible to us, and I would argue that that's very, very purposeful. So that was me 12 years ago. People were invisible to me. I couldn't see it. I didn't know what was happening behind the kitchen door. And then 9/11 happened, and my life, and of course hundreds of thousands of people's lives around the globe, changed. But for me, my dining experience changed as well. Because on September 11th, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1 in New York City called Windows on the World. It was on the 107th floor, and on that morning, when the plane hit at 9/11, 73 workers died, and about 250 workers lost their jobs, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks following the tragedy. And there was a tiny little union inside that restaurant, HERE, which later merged with Unite to become Unite Here, but it was a small union in New York City because less than 0.001% of all restaurant workers in the United States are unionized. And so this little union said, we don't have the capacity to provide support to all the workers that have lost their jobs or the families of the victims. And they called me, and they called one of the lead waiters from Windows on the World, who's actually a shop steward in the restaurant, whose name is actually on some of your tables, a guy named Fekak Mamdou, an immigrant from Morocco who worked in the industry for 17 years before 9/11 happened. They brought us together and we started this little organization as a relief center post 9/11. And what started as a little relief center post 9/11 has grown into a national restaurant workers organization that we call ROC, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, with now 10,000 members in 32 cities across the country, with 100 employer partners. Thanks. We now have about 100 employer partners. These are owners who actually are doing the right thing, providing good wages and good working conditions. They range from people like Tom Colicchio, star of Top Chef, who's actually a great employer and partner of ours, all the way down to small mom and pop restaurants. And we've actually organized several thousand consumer members as well. And we've won things. We've actually won about 15 campaigns against large, high-profile restaurant companies. We've won back about $7 million in stolen tips and wages. We've actually opened 2 worker-owned restaurants, Colors, one in New York, one in Detroit, and soon another one to open in New Orleans. We've trained thousands of workers, about 5,000 workers of color, to move up the ladder to livable wage jobs in the industry, which are fine dining, waitstaff, and bartending positions. We've done lots and lots of research, and we've won some policy changes. We raised the minimum wage for workers in New York State, and we we made it illegal in Philadelphia to deduct credit card processing fees from workers' tips, which unfortunately is legal everywhere else, including here, which is why you should pay your tips in cash. So we've won some things. Thank you. We've won some things. It's been an incredibly intense 12 years, but it's definitely not enough. And the most incredible thing for me personally has been just getting to know the stories of thousands and thousands of workers who inspire me daily, like Jason, like so many other workers around the country, like the workers who are on your tables, the stories of the workers on your tables, and who've taught me so much. Because 12 years ago, I was a New Yorker, and I thought, wow, as a good New Yorker, I should tip well. I was told when you go to New York, tip 20%, so I tipped 20%. I had no idea that in New York and in 43 states in the United States, the tip that I was leaving was not on top of a wage. It actually was the wage itself. Washington State is different. Washington has the same minimum wage for tipped and non-tipped workers, but the tip minimum wage at the federal level actually is $2.13 an hour, which means that people rely on our tips to live. I knew something about health and safety in restaurants. I grew up in LA where they actually put letter grades in restaurant windows to tell you about sanitation. I had no idea that 90% of restaurant workers in America don't have paid sick days, which means 2/3 report cooking, preparing, and serving our food when they're sick. Sick with hepatitis A, true story. Sick with H1N1 or swine flu, true story in my book. I just met a worker in Florida who worked regularly with typhoid fever. These are the kinds of stories you hear daily, not because workers want to work when they're sick, but because they're forced to. There are over 10 million restaurant workers in America. It is right now the second largest and the absolute fastest growing employer in the United States. In fact, 1 in 12 of us right now works in the restaurant industry. It is the industry that is providing jobs to any new entrants into the economy, whether they be immigrants or young people, anybody who's looking for a job. These are the jobs that are out there, and yet they happen to be the absolute lowest paying jobs in America. 7 of the 11 lowest paying jobs in the US, and the 2 absolute lowest paying jobs in America, according to the US Department of Labor, lower than every other kind of job you can think of, lower than farm workers, lower than every other job you may think of as a low paying job, are the people who touch our food. And why? How is it that you've got the largest and fastest growing segment of the US economy proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs? It's not because they have razor-thin profit margins, as the industry would like you to know. It is because of the power of a group you must know about, called the National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA. They are the other NRA. By the way, they're the same people who got ketchup declared a vegetable in Congress and pizza declared a vegetable in Congress. They will kill us one way or another. Back in 1996, under the leadership of a man named Herman Cain, hopefully you remember Herman Cain. Back in 1996, Herman Cain, as the leader of the other NRA, struck a deal with Congress, saying that they, the NRA, would not oppose an increase to the overall minimum wage as long as the minimum wage for tipped workers stayed frozen forever. And so it has been stuck at $2.13 an hour for the last 22 years. This is not the only way that they have done this behind closed door deal. It's not just in Congress. Every time in any state there's a minimum wage or paid sick days proposal, they show up at the last minute and demand an exemption. Even here in Seattle, it happened. There was a paid sick days ordinance, which was wonderful, meaning that lots of workers in Seattle got a paid sick day, but a lot of people didn't know at the last minute. Restaurants showed up and said, well, there should be an exemption for anybody who has a shift. They should be able to swap shifts if they're sick. So essentially for restaurant workers, that meant instead of taking a paid sick day, just find somebody else to work your shift. It'd be the same thing as telling a lawyer, don't worry if you're sick, don't work today, just come in on Saturday. What do you think a worker does if they're sick and they can't afford not to take a day off? They work, which means they're cooking, preparing, and serving our food with all kinds of illnesses. And they're working at $2.13 an hour. 70% of those workers working at $2.13 an hour are women. They work at Red Lobster and Olive Garden and Applebee's and IHOP. In majority, they are women. They suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the US workforce and use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce, meaning the people who put food on our tables cannot afford to eat themselves. So take, for example, a worker in my book, Claudia Munoz, who was an immigrant from Mexico. She's actually a leader of rock. She was a leader in New Orleans and then in Texas. She went on to become a really famous person in the dream activist world. But when she was with us, she told us the story about her own experience working at the IHOP in Houston, Texas, where she earned $2.13 an hour. And when you earn $2.13 an hour, you get a pay stub that says this is not a paycheck, and it says 0 because your wages go entirely to taxes and you live on your tips. And Claudia would live on her tips, sometimes 4, sometimes 3, sometimes $0 an hour, and she was hungry. She says, Saru, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I would go to the restaurant and flirt with the managers or the cooks to get extra food to eat because I was so hungry. And one night, Claudia worked a full night shift at the IHOP in Houston, Texas, and at the end of the night, a couple walked out without paying the bill, and the IHOP, international corporation though it is, and even though it is illegal, said, we're not gonna pay for this bill. You have to pay for this bill from the tips you've earned all night. And the bill happened to be $20 more than everything she had earned, meaning that Claudia left that night paying $20 for the luxury of having worked at the IHOP in Houston, Texas. And it's so funny, I've heard this story so many times and I've repeated it so many times. And I've said it all over the country, and every time I say it, somebody comes up to me and says, that was my story. In fact, I was speaking in Northwest Arkansas, and those of you in the food movement should know something about Northwest Arkansas. It is the home of the poultry processing world of America. It is the home of Smithfield and Cargill and Tyson. It's also the home of Walmart, right? It is the belly of the beast, and it is a pretty conservative place. So I was asked to go speak there, and I thought I was going to be killed. And a state legislator was going to speak right after me, and I told Claudia's story, and I was sure he was going to get up after me and say, she doesn't know what she's talking about, raising the wage would kill jobs, which is what they always say, or it would make prices go way up. He got up there and he said, thank you very much. I just want to say to what she said, that happened to me every night I worked in the restaurant. That guy worked in a bar all growing up, and every night they would ask him to pay for customer walkouts. I bet so many of you in this room have worked in the restaurant industry at some point in your life. But let me tell you something, whether you stay in the industry for your lifetimes, which most people who work in the industry do, they don't actually move on to something better, as the NRA likes to say. I find it the most hilarious argument. They say, it's okay that we treat these people this way, they're just passing through to something better, which means everything else in the world is better than their industry, right? But that's what they say, right? But the truth is, it's majority adults who stay there. But even if you worked in the industry and you moved on to something else, keep this in mind. When Herman Cain and his affairs at the NRA became public, MSNBC reported that although 7% of American women work in the industry, 37% of all sexual harassment claims to the EEOC come from restaurants. Which means that for any of us who have daughters, and I have two, we have to care. Because this is the job our daughters will probably take when they go through high school, college, or maybe stay in for their lifetimes. And this is the job that exposes them to the world of work, a world in which they can be paid $2.13 an hour, a world in which they can be touched and grabbed inappropriately. And on my book tour, I swear, every time I say that, some woman comes up to me afterwards and says, you told my story. I work now as an IBM executive and I've been sexually harassed, but I never complained because it was never as bad as what I experienced in the restaurant industry. Every time I speak, a woman says that to me. We have to care. Thankfully, there is good news on the horizon. One piece of good news is that we're coming to Seattle. We're starting a rock here in Seattle. Really exciting. We are opening our doors. We are starting to survey restaurant workers across the city, across the region. We are building a membership. We are offering free training programs for workers to move from fast food into fine dining or from busser positions into waiter positions like you saw in the film. But the other piece of good news at the federal level is that finally, after years and years of fighting, congressional leadership has introduced a bill in Congress that would finally overcome the legacy of Herman Cain. It is called the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2013. It proposes to raise the tipped minimum wage to 70% of the regular, a tripling, 300% increase for workers who earn $2.13 an hour. It would be huge. And it actually has a chance to win. It's a big deal, but it's just been introduced. And when it was introduced, the Congress member who introduced it told us, look, the truth is, to overcome the power of the National Restaurant Association, we will need to see a groundswell of public support. Crazy, right? To not listen to these trade lobbyists, we would need to see a groundswell of people who support an increase in the minimum wage. Well, we thought about that. We had actually seen a groundswell in the restaurant industry over the last decade of organizing. It wasn't about workers' wages and benefits. It was when Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma, came out, and Eric Schlosser's book, Fast Food Nation, came out. We saw a groundswell of public demand. 10 years ago in New York City, I remember restaurants saying, we could never afford locally sourced organic food. And those same restaurants now jumping over themselves to say, we provide locally sourced organic food, whether or not they do. Right? You know it. And that was because consumers read a book and decided to do something about it. So we looked at this growing food movement and we said, how can we replicate that success? And how can we partner with this movement to expand the definition of sustainable food to include sustainable working conditions for the people who touch our food? How can we do that? Well, the first thing that we did is we created an alliance called the Food Chain Workers Alliance, an alliance of worker organizations from farm workers to meat and poultry processing workers to food retail and distribution workers to restaurant workers. And today the alliance represents over 150,000 workers in 15 organizations across the country. It's exciting and it's beginning to change the definition. And in fact, after creating the alliance, we actually created a smartphone app and diner's guide so that you can download it on your smartphone app for free. It's called the ROC National Diners Guide, and it tells you how restaurants around you are faring on issues of wages and benefits. And it's funny, Mark Bittman, famous food writer for the New York Times, when we created the Alliance, we made the smartphone app, he paid attention. He wrote an article called The 20 Million, about the 20 million people in our food system. And he said, foodies, wake up. If you've thought about the cows and the pigs, why haven't you thought about the people? And on that day, 100,000 people visited our website to download our guide and our app. And somebody actually wrote in and said, I never thought about the people. I thought about the cows and the pigs. I never thought about the people. It seems like you're on the cusp of something big. And it really felt that way, except we felt like we hadn't reached our Michael Pollan moment, which is why we wrote the book, Behind the Kitchen Door. So we're asking 3 things of everybody who eats out, or everybody who eats, or everybody who has a conscience, or everybody who's just alive. 3 things. First, read the book. Please get the book, read the book, tell other people you know, because it was Omnivore's Dilemma and Fast Food Nation that helped to seed or helped to grow a movement that was already there, but really exploded it and helped it reach a much wider audience of people who are suddenly turned on to the idea of local and organic. We can suddenly turn people on to the idea of people in the food system by getting them the education that they need, right? Danny Glover's movie company, Louverture Films, has created a series of beautiful short film portraits about the workers and employers profiled in the book. All of that can be seen in number 2, the second thing I'm going to ask, which is to visit the website, thewelcometable.net. A website we've created for consumers to sign a petition to ask Congress to raise that ridiculous minimum wage for tipped workers. Already over 100,000 people have gone to that website and signed that petition, and you can join them. And number 3, and then I'll shut up because I know I'm over time. And I know you want to eat, and you want to forget about the stories I've told you. Number 3, last thing I'm going to say. In the same way that over the last 10 years, consumers have asked, is this locally sourced? Is this organic? You know, where did this come from? And that created change. We're asking every single person to eat, when you eat out, wherever you eat out wherever, but at the end of your meal, to go up to the manager or the owner, not your server, the manager or the owner, and say, I loved the food, I love the service, I would love to see you provide paid sick days, I would love to see you provide a livable wage. These things are important to me as a consumer. I would love to see you promote people of color to front of house positions. And I'll give you one quick example of how I did it, and then I promise I'll sit down. Which is that when my first baby was born, we went and had one of those amazing, special, wonderful moments at a restaurant. Her first outing to a restaurant. And we went there. It was a great, locally sourcing, organic, vegetarian restaurant. It was really popular. We took pictures of the baby, had a great time. But I happened to notice, as I'm sure is true all over Seattle, all the servers were white and all the bussers were people of color. And if you peeked in the kitchen, all the people in the kitchen were people of color. So at the end of my meal, we paid the bill, my husband left with the baby, I walked up to the owner and I said, I love the food, I love the service, but I happened to notice all the servers are white, all the bussers are people of color. I think they'd make great servers. What kind of training and promotion opportunities have you given them? And they said, oh, I don't know. I don't think they want to be servers. Nobody's ever asked me to be a server. You laugh, but it may be true. We did a match pairs testing study in New York City. If you don't know what that is, we sent 200 pairs of white and people of color applicants into fine dining restaurants. The people of color having a better resume, and found that the white applicants had twice the chance of a person of color getting one of these resumes. And then we gave them accents, because the industry's always saying, oh, isn't it because they're illegal or they can't speak English? So we gave the white workers an unintelligible European accent. And the people of color, a slight non-European accent, and an unintelligible European accent we found was a bonus in getting a job. Whereas any kind of accent was a detractor. So, part of the issue is that people of color will not ask for a server job if they've never seen anybody who looks like them in a server position. So I said, I appreciate that, but I just want you to know it's so important to me as a customer to see diversity in the workplace, and God, is it important to me as a mother that my little brown daughter sees people like her in every position in this restaurant. And he said, okay, thank you very much. You know, what was he going to do? Was he going to spit at me or slap me? Sometimes I go around the country and say, and I hear these whispers, oh, I could never do that. I could never say something. But, we say things about so many other things. I don't like this food, take it back. Or is this organic? Is this local? Or what's in this? Is there pork here? But we're not willing to say, do you provide a livable wage? Or do you provide paid sick days? Or can you please promote people of color to a server position to serve me? These things are just as important, and if we don't say it, we are going to end up with an industry that impacts our health, right? Our economy, our future. We need this for workers, for employers, for every one of us who eats out. Thank you.